MH370 is an aviation mystery unlike any other. It's not just that 239 people disappeared into the night 10 years ago. It's that the evidence itself is so deeply weird. Time and time again, reasonable assumptions that any normal person would make turn out to be wrong. MH370 isn't just aviation's greatest mystery, although it is, but it's also a collection of smaller mysteries.
Here are 5 of the most mind-blowing mysteries of MH370. Question 1. Who made the plane go dark 40 minutes into the flight, and why?
Yeah, this is the opening mystery of this whole event. It's a normal flight from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. 40 minutes in, for reasons to this day no one can explain, the plane goes electronically dark and it throws an aggressive U-turn and heads back over the Malayan Peninsula. We just don't know why somebody would have done this.
And it's not one of those things that you could do with an autopilot. This is pilot control.
We know it was pilot controlled because it was so aggressive that it's too aggressive for the autopilot to carry out by itself. Somebody commanded this turn. No motive makes any sense, and it's not really clear why anybody would want to do this.
Question number 2. Why did the SATCOM system turn back on an hour after it went dark?
This, for me, is the crux of the whole mystery. It's not where the mystery started, but it's the part of it that we have the hardest time grappling with. This is actually the key to everything that happens over the next 6 hours, where we know the plane was flying, we have this Inmarsat data, but we are so puzzled by it. Now, the plane was completely dark. It had turned around. It was seen on Malaysian military radar, but then 3 minutes after it leaves Malaysian military radar, at a point where it was completely invisible to the world, it could have gone anywhere, done anything. They were scot-free. And yet, the satellite system gets turned back on, and it produces the signals that will let investigators figure out where to look for it. The thing that is really puzzling about this is there's 2 parts, really. One is it's something that most airline captains don't know how to do. You can look it up, you can figure out by reading the manual how to do this thing, but it's not something the average airline captain knows about, because I've talked to many of them. So how did whoever did this know how to do it? And then secondly, why? What would be the motive for turning the SATCOM system back on? It would let you use the phone, for instance, the satellite phone, but that satellite phone wasn't used. And so it's really baffling both how whoever took this plane knew how to do it and why they would do it.
Till that SATCOM system turned back on, it was easy enough to say this was a catastrophic accident or that the pilot made some emergency maneuver and all those systems were turned off. The thing is turning it back on signaled intent.
It signals intent and sophistication. So it really changes the tenor of the whole conversation. And yet, it's something that many people who have commented on this mystery have completely overlooked. I think this really needs to be core because everything that happens follows from this mysterious act. So this is really, when I say that the MH370 mystery has itself mysteries embedded with it, this is the one that I think is the most baffling and the most important.
Question number 3. Why wasn't the plane found on the southern seabed?
After scientists at Inmarsat realized that they had this data, or more technically correct to say the metadata, the data about the information being exchanged between the plane and the satellite, they were able to put their heads together and after a lot of work come up with a rather sophisticated new kind of mathematics that allowed them to derive quite narrowly where on the seabed they should find the wreckage of this plane. Where was the plane located when it sent its final transmissions? And yet, after spending multiple years searching the seabed and covering an area the size of Great Britain, nothing was found on the seabed. Nothing was there. Why wasn't it there? You might be tempted to say, well, the ocean is big, it's hard to find things. But they had been able to define quite precisely where to look, and yet it wasn't there. Why wasn't it there? How come this puzzling circumstance arose, and how do we explain it? Most people who look at this from a sort of mainstream perspective just find it easy to completely overlook. They act as if it's not a huge problem. In the course of this podcast, we explain why it really is a big problem and how we can grapple with it.
It is a huge problem. Planes don't disappear, and eventually they get found.
Never before has so much effort been put into finding a missing plane and hundreds of millions of dollars without result.
Question number 4. When scientists looked at all the marine sea life on the debris, it looked way too young. Why?
For a year and a half after MH370 disappeared, a lot of people were wondering, well, how come there isn't any floating debris? Nothing's been spotted from the air. Nothing has been found washed up on beaches. Where did the wreckage go? Where did the floating debris go? Well, finally, after a year and a half, the first piece was found washed up on the French island of La Réunion in the western part of the Indian Ocean. And for many people, that was case closed. Okay, now we know that the plane went into the ocean because we have a piece of wreckage that obviously floated from the impact site. Well, hang on. If you look closer at the evidence, it again turns puzzling because this piece was completely covered in a kind of barnacle called Lepus annitifera, a goose barnacle. And scientists can determine the temperature of the water it was floating through and how old the barnacles are by analyzing their shells. And when they did that, they found out that it looked like these barnacles were only a couple of months old, not a year and a half. So how do you explain that discrepancy? Why is the sea life growing on these pieces of debris so much younger than you would expect given how long it's supposedly in the water?
Question number 5. How was one guy able to find all this debris?
This is a really controversial question. As time went by, more and more pieces of debris were found washed up in various places, all of them in the western part of the Indian Ocean, which itself had implications about where the plane might have impacted if this debris did in fact come from a crash site. Here's a part that some people have raised questions about. Most of the pieces, there were about 3 dozen pieces that were eventually collected. Some of them, not all of them, were definitively shown to be from MH370, but most of the pieces that were collected by a single individual. Now, probabilistically, given how huge the ocean is, how much coastline there is, how many people were looking, you would expect that not to be the case. That basically the chances of any given person finding any piece of debris is very, very low. But one guy seems to have defied the odds. Was he just very lucky, or did he have a secret that nobody else knew about? That's something we're going to look at in a future episode.
All of these individual mysteries roll up into the bigger mystery, which is what happened to this plane? What happened to the people? How do we solve this mystery? Can we solve this mystery? Does somebody know the answer? And how do we get people to pay attention?
All of these mysteries themselves demand explanation. And the only way to do that is by building brick upon brick of fact and really rock-solid inference. It's really important for people to understand that this case has a nature of its own. It has a character that sort of emerges from all the pieces of evidence. And so that if you look at the evidence only in a granular way, you won't get the sense of the character of the case. And time again, we see the same thing happening. Something happens, some evidence emerges, it seems to mean one thing, but then as you look closer, it turns out to have levels of intricacy that you might not expect. And so now that we've been on this journey for 4 months, I think our listeners and viewers can really understand what I mean when I say that the closer you look at it, the weirder it gets. Going forward, we're going to see that in future episodes too. We teased at some of those in the 5 weirdest mysteries that we just went through. And those aren't even all of them, I hasten to add. There are many more aspects. It's almost like a fractal where you zoom in and it like there's the same pattern, and you zoom in and there's the same pattern. It's like the closer you look, things just consistently don't add up. And I'm a journalist, and I look at things for a living. And I take a question, some event has occurred, and I want to try to understand, the classic, who, when, where, why, what, and try to answer those questions. And normally, as you dig in, clarity emerges. Facts tend to reinforce themselves.
This morning you were working on a piece about decompression on an Alaska Airlines flight.
All of these things are continuing to unfold. But to put these two things together, on the one hand you had a sort of catastrophic decompression as a plane was climbing through 16,000 feet out of Portland, Oregon. And as you look at it, it all makes sense. Like, you can very quickly start to piece together a narrative about how, like, this plane has a history of technical problems. This was a new plane. This section of the fuselage blew out under the difference in pressurization. It all kind of makes sense. It all fits together. And as we find more information, it will tend to confirm what we already knew. Whereas with MH370, each new piece of information just actually makes it fuzzier and foggier, and we really struggle to how do we explain all of this. And so a lot of times people have the initial reaction to MH370 is, well, I'm sure it's a simple case. Well, didn't I hear that the pilot took it?
Yeah.
And so people assume, especially in the early days, Andy, what you would hear time and time again is people would invoke Occam's razor. We know that whoever took this plane was aggressive, was sophisticated, and seemed intent on some degree of deception.
I mean, look, whether you think it's UFOs or you think it's the pilot or you think it's the Russians, there is some degree of trickery involved in this. I think that pretty much most people think that some sort of deception and trickery happened, which is why the Occam's razor thing goes out the window.
Does not apply.
It just doesn't apply here because it's it isn't the simplest explanation. It's the most realistic in this case. It might have been until some of this information was discovered, but once that happened, it was too late.
And so people seem to think they are entitled to a simple explanation. People think that to propose a theory that isn't simple is somehow violating their rights. People actually get angry at me. Listen, I could be a jerk, but that has nothing to do with the fact of what is the evidence in the case? How do we explain the evidence of the case? What is a valid hypothesis? What is not a valid hypothesis? How do we rate the relative probability of the different hypotheses? We can talk about these things and still be jerks. You know what I mean? And listen, not nobody's going to be a fan of everybody else. Right?
No, and I don't mind that. That's okay because I'm glad that they're paying attention. And it's, when they stop commenting, then we have a problem. But I should point out that I'm not 100% sold on the theory that you present in the book. I don't know if you're 100% sold on it. It's just the one that you think is the best one.
My goal is not to sell.
Yeah.
My goal is not to sell. What we're trying to do here really isn't. There's so many podcasts and documentaries out there where people are like, I have the answer and I'm going to try to convince you. And this is very dangerous. In fact, at some point, maybe in the future, I think it might be fun or interesting to go through some of the other major theories that are out there because people are always writing to me saying, oh, what do you think about this person's theory? And it's a distraction from, I think, getting the basics down, which is what we're trying to do now. But I can envisage a point in the future where we do look at some of these theories. But I think there's a common problem to all of them, which is that they try to sell a theory, and in doing so, they overlook the problematic nature of the evidence itself, which is what we talked about in the teaser that we just recorded.
So what I'm saying is, I think if some evidence came forward that said Zahari it proved that he did it, you'd be like, all right, cool. Now we have the answer. I mean, you're not going to live.
That sort of happened when the flight simulator data was released. I was the one who was the first person to write about it. I mean, I said this is very pro Zahari. Now, it wasn't completely probative, I don't think, but if any evidence that comes forward, I will talk about it, and I will try to incorporate it into the relative probabilities.
So that's why this is an ongoing podcast because stuff is still happening, and truthfully, if this mystery gets solved and your theory is wrong, I think you'll probably be the first to admit it, because you're not claiming you know the answers.
I don't want to think of it as my theory. Some of the most important work on the vulnerability hypothesis was done by Victor Iannello, not me. I mean, it should be called the Iannello hypothesis. Now he has said in no uncertain terms that he doesn't think it was carried out, but he's the one who did all the math and really kind of did the deep dive digging that allowed him to formulate it.
Right.
The journey of looking at MH370 has been an ongoing one. And so I just want to alert readers and viewers and listeners that I actually did an article for New York Magazine, which, as I'm speaking today, recently came out.
It's awesome. It's really good.
And it was about the vulnerability. There are all these. I proposed that MH370 was basically an exploitation of a vulnerability.
Yeah.
It was a sort of a hack. And what has become clear in the intervening years is that there's actually a lot of cybersecurity vulnerabilities in planes that are flying today. Different vulnerabilities from MH370. What was done to that plane could never be done again because of the peculiarities of the circumstances. But I do think, and I intend to cover this more in years ahead, because I think it's going to be an important and growing issue, is that cybersecurity is going to be increasingly important for all infrastructure, and commercial aviation is a kind of infrastructure.
I really loved that article, Jeff. I thought it was
Thank you.
really good. And you talked about GPS technology and hacking and all that stuff, and it raised even more questions for me.
Yeah.
So it's like,
It all ties
how big do we
together.
get on? How big do we get on this? You know?
Yeah. So again, but Andy, it's like if you are on a productive line of inquiry, stuff keeps happening, right?
Yeah.
And this is something that's definitely going to come to the fore in future episodes, like pretty far down the line. But if we're proposing that MH370 was operating in a hostile environment, did more hostile attacks happen in other contexts? And the answer is definitely yes.
For sure.